Exercise foresight, poor eyesight, couldn't fist fight, had to overcompensate. Learn to be clairvoyant, see around corners, read signals and warnings, interpret omens, respond accordingly.
Broadcast from later, we are exchanging weak signals of change and trying to understand their significance. A weak signal of change is just something that we notice. It could be an event, an idea, an issue, a development that we don't fully understand yet, but we suspect it might be meaningful in shaping the futures of our lives and society. As foresight strategists at From Later, we're steadily tracking and trying to make sense of what's changing. And on these broadcasts, we give a glimpse of what it looks like when you're trying to understand something you don't know anything about. It's basically structured like show and tell. A few of us each bring in a signal. The rest of us do not know what that item is in advance. And collectively, we're all trying to make sense of it. If you're listening and you feel lost, so do we. You don't understand what we're talking about. We don't understand what we're talking about. We're trying, though. I don't know anything. Everybody's just trying to figure it out as we go. Today on the Room call, we got Valdez, Erica, our producers, Jeremy and Serena. I'm Robert Bolton, and our guest is Kapil Vachhar. Kapil, how are you doing?
Good, Rob. Thanks for having me. Excited to figure things out with you guys. Hopefully it's messy.
Yeah, thank you for joining. Kapil's a designer and a researcher. His background is in development, information technology, healthcare, news media, and he's the co-founder of Commonplace. Can you tell us a bit about Commonplace and what you're doing in that enterprise?
Yeah, sure. Commonplace is an impact organization. It's a space where researchers, strategists, technologists, and designers, all who've been working in the social development space, who had a vision for community-owned futures. It started off as just an Excel sheet with a bunch of 10 people on an Excel sheet trying to figure things out, working across different organizations. And over time, it turned into what it is right now, which is a social enterprise, or how we simply term it, for sustainable impact business. What we do at Commonplace, our overarching goal is to create knowledge commons, which are inclusive and sustainable and are developed with communities. We also work with certain clients in topics of public health, gender, livelihoods, climate change, and accessibility. So that's the Cliff Notes version of what we do.
Cool. So can you give an example? Let's take us into the spreadsheet, maybe the Excel sheet that existed. Like, what is an example of one of the communities, and what is one of the bodies of knowledge, for example, that becomes commons?
Yeah, sure. So I'll take an example from the past of like when we were just about to start out and where we are today. So working in the development space, very similar to like working at a Fortune 500 company, there's a lot of different teams working on a lot of different projects which affect a ton of people, but there is this gap that exists in terms of collaboration across different departments. In our case, particularly across different organizations. So you would think working in the public impact health space that if I'm working towards sexual reproductive health for young girls and there are 10 other organizations, we're all working together, we're all sharing information. Unfortunately, that's not really the reality for various different reasons. So the Excel sheet kind of came about when COVID happened, where a lot of our work that happens, particularly in the communities that we work with, which are low resource communities in the global south, particularly in my geography of India, northern India, everything that happens face to face. So right when the pandemic hit, you didn't really have access to millions of people who were really reliant upon you, not for just public health information, but for even livelihood information, access to social benefits, access to social schemes. It essentially disconnected a huge population from very critical health services. So Commonplace was kind of the aspect of the spreadsheet kind of came together of working across organizations of like, hey, I don't know how to do remote research in the Himalayan region. Can somebody help me? I don't understand how to use Zoom because a lot of the professionals that I work with are fairly older. They're not as attuned to technology. Then you have other aspects of privacy that come in. If I'm working on a digital solution, like if I'm going through a Zoom call and I'm talking to somebody from a vulnerable community, there's different power dynamics that come in play. Are there risks of private information getting leaked? Are there risks of information being manipulated? A number of different factors that came through. So Commonplace kind of started off in that messy area of how do I really work together? My organization doesn't really want to collaborate, but I knew I need to do it. It's my necessity. And we started off as this informal group. What we do right now and how it's kind of transformed now is, so just an example of a knowledge common is our first program, which is launching in September. It's focused at adolescent girls, where we're trying to enhance their abilities to kind of navigate their daily lives. And what I really mean here is you see a lot of tools, resources, solutions that exist in the space, which are about empowering girls, but sometimes they do not reflect the lived experiences that these girls have, like living in a very patriarchal society with various different social structures, like in India, particularly the caste dynamic, gender dynamic, the age group factors heavily influence like what type of information particularly girls are able to access to, and even the information that they're being provided. Is this even realistic to your lived experience? Is this your experience of, so like I know, for example, contraception is a hot button issue right now, and abortion is a hot button issue right now. In India, where abortion is legal, it's fairly controversial for a different reason, which is this aspect of the type of information that's available to young girls or to women in general doesn't really translate with how it's applied on the ground. So we, through our programs, are trying to create tools which are A, realistic to their experiences, B, which are created with them. Like, we don't want to impose solutions that we feel are appropriate. Rather, we want to understand from them, what do you feel as a 14-year-old, 15-year-old, 16-year-old girl? What do you feel like you want to apply? What solutions do you have that you feel like other girls in your neighborhood should be, or in your community should be applying? And lastly, we kind of apply this aspect of just digital literacy and upskilling, because we're in an increasingly digital age, and we kind of work with them to kind of improve their understanding around how to use a smartphone, how do you leverage a smartphone, how do you leverage discussions with peer support networks through a digital medium, and how do you navigate family structures. So that's like two ways of what we were and where we are today.
That's amazing. And speaking like more generally about the process, like you referred to it as community-owned futures. Is there, and you as well, just we're referring to, co-creating the solutions together. Can you talk more to why you use the language of futures as opposed to presence, and what that means to be kind of co-creating, or what a community-owned future is or looks like, or how each one is determined with the groups you're working with?
So this is a question that, very honestly, we still struggle to kind of find a good solution to, for not because it's not areas like coming from an innovation background, you talk about futures, you like working on some foresight projects, there's a good understanding, but it's more on a personal connection level. To put it very bluntly, being an upper class straight male coming from an urban space, going into these rural communities and working with community members to identify what their future should be becomes very problematic. So we're trying to kind of navigate that space of being someone who's extremely privileged, being someone who's coming from a space where we have a lot of power when we go into these spaces. How can we accurately, and how should we effectively help them? So we kind of toe with the idea of futures. We use the phrase futures very loosely. It's about the present and the futures. Mm-hmm. So what we try to do with them is kind of have this kind of discussion with them around what we feel like are avenues that they feel they require support on, because there is a very a stark skills gap, there is a very stark knowledge gap that exists, but at the same time also receive what their understanding is and what they believe are the most immediate problems for them. So some of the approaches that we kind of apply is, it kind of breaks down into this threefold approach. We work with them to set up direct to consumer networks. So right now, a lot of health-based programming, or just social programming in general, it's done through NGOs, it's done through government infrastructures, which again are not the most inclusive. So we try to work with them. Okay, how do you imagine a direct to consumer infrastructure in the future? Of course, we would like to have it in the present, because these needs are critical, they're needs in the now. But we're also acknowledging the fact that we don't have infinite resources. We have very limited resources. We are working with a process with communities it's going to be a very long process. So we try to imagine both ways that we can support them in the present, but our overarching ambition is to kind of identify with them, like, what is the future you're really hoping towards, you're really imagining, and how can we kind of sustain or help you in that process? So when we say futures or community-owned futures, we truly mean community-owned futures. We don't go into these spaces and be like, hey, these are my ideals and these are my principles and this is how you should do. Rather, it's more of an exchange process. The other two pathways, there are two common approaches that we do, or that we kind of undertake in our process, is taking into this idea of creating sustainable outreach channels. A lot of access or communication that happens with vulnerable communities, especially communities who are in either isolated neighborhoods, whether it's in forest communities, tribal communities, or just communities in general who are isolated because they just don't have access to digital technologies. How can we create more sustainable outreach opportunities or sustainable outreach channels for them? If we look at the current channels, you either going through a smartphone or you're going through physical interactions. Both of them have a high cost. Smartphones, even though they're very cheap, like $100 smartphone is still, it's a huge amount for somebody who's only earning $2, $1 a day. So how can we imagine more sustainable channels that exist using infrastructures which are already in place in these locations, that they're a lot of informal outreach channels that exist that not necessarily are used by government channels or NGOs. And lastly, our last approach, and I think this is kind of the backbone of our foundation is, and that's why digital literacy is a big foundation for our program as well, is this aspect of creating digital communities. If I look at Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, actually, let's look at TikTok. TikTok got banned in India about 2 years ago. And TikTok was one of the only social media platforms which was heavily adopted by people coming from vulnerable communities, lower social economic stratas, because it seemed like a space which was not defined as Facebook or Instagram as a space for urban elite. It was heavily used. It got banned by the Indian government, unfortunately, 2 years ago for various different political reasons, and it's left a huge gap. But at the same time, it showed a huge opportunity that you have this entire generation of people who are interested in vocalizing themselves, who want to vocalize themselves, just never had the platform. So we look into if since these platforms no longer exist, what can we do, whether it's through hyper-localized peer networks or just hyper-localized digital communities that you're able to engage with yourselves and have discussions. So those are kind of like the three overarching topics that we use.
That's fascinating. Is there a alternative to TikTok or something that's been able to be adopted? And I'm so curious too, can you like replicate that sort of cultural sense that this is a place for us with not this other kind of otherwise elite or whatever assumption about what Instagram and Facebook are?
There's an Indian version of, I don't want to go into the more political territory, but India is on a very similar path to how digital technology slowly got taken over by the government. So like we have our own version of Twitter now. We have our own version of TikTok. So it's called Moji. It's by an Indian-owned company. They're trying to it's essentially a ripoff of TikTok. So these platforms do exist, but the benefit of TikTok was because it was not based in India, it was not by an Indian-owned organization, there was a level of freedom. There was a lack of control. With Moji, with some of these other Indian knockoffs, it has the impression of a free and open space, but it's heavily censored. Like I was part of a study recently, which was kind of looking at emerging digital patterns which were coming on these up and coming TikTok replacement platforms. Majority of their content was hyper nationalistic, hyper masculine. So it didn't have that realm of kind of like in TikTok, a lot of the stories you would see, like my favorite videos was this 25-year-old woman who was working in the farm and she was rapping to Biggie Smalls. You would not imagine that visual. Unfortunately, you don't see that on these newer platforms because again, they're very catered to a traditional mindset. They're very catered to a nationalistic mindset and a heavily male-dominated mindset.
So it feels like you're on a roll. So I'm going to start with you. What's your weakest signal?
So it's kind of going on the same thread. My weakest signal is the emergence of hyper-local and female-led journalism.
Cool.
So what we've seen recently as India, I'll take the example of India, but it's been demonstrated in Africa and different countries as well. As you see the emergence of more and more authoritative states, you see mainstream journalism kind of being more of a monolith as compared to the different opinions that, especially in India, that it used to have. A lot of the conversations, a lot of the situations which are happening in rural communities are just not getting covered. So we've seen very recently this emergence of female-led journalism. So this aspect of providing access to women with certain skills that they previously did not have and becoming the reporters on the ground. So just to share an example, just this year, there was an Oscar-nominated documentary called Writing with Fire, which is about this organization called Khabar Lahariya, which started about 25 years ago, but it's only kind of reached a significant scale in the recent years, which is an entirely female-led journalism media organization. All of the women are from rural communities. They write their own stories. They publish their own stories. Their head of operations, their editor is from the community. So it's a very clear example of a community-owned output. So yeah, I'm kind of excited for this signal and what this future holds.
Cool. It's called Khabar Lahariya?
Khabar Lahariya.
Cool. Can you tell us what's their mission, for example?
So a lot of again, India has a very severe caste structure. A lot of the women who are part of Khabar Lahariya are coming from Dalit or Bahujan castes, which are generally seen as lower castes. So a lot of, if anybody's familiar with like even some history of India, access to education and access to technology has always been restricted with people from certain communities. So Khabar Lahariya is kind of trying to overcome that barrier, because if you don't, it's the same thing as you would see with like the Black Lives Movement, right? If you don't have a Black journalist talking about injustices that are happening in the Black community, they're not going to get reported. It's the same thing in the Dalit Bahujan movement, where they're kind of providing avenues to these women to talk about the stories that they feel are relevant from their communities. It's female-led because they want to have this aspect of women are generally seen as invisible in our societies, at least in the heavily patriarchal societies that India tends to born out. So their mission is more towards kind of flipping that on its head, of providing women with access to certain tools, which helps them shine lights on these different stories, and often brutal stories which are happening in rural India.
Right. And what channels and formats are they using?
So it started off as just a newspaper. India is one of the only countries, I would say, or one of the few countries where newspaper is still a profitable business. But now it's turned into, they launched their online website 4 years ago, and they now have a very successful Instagram channel. So it's, I would say majority is print media, but they're slowly coming into the digital space as well.
Cool. Can you spell it for us, or how we might find it?
Khabar Lahariya. I would really recommend the documentary Writing with Fire, which came out this year. It talks about their struggle.
Who made the documentary? Is that something that was made by Khabar Lahariya, or?
It was made by two up-and-coming filmmakers. It's a bit controversial, but I won't go into that. But yeah, it's a very interesting take into the type of futures that we often talk about, community-owned futures. What could they be?
Mm-hmm. Okay, and what do you think this might signal? Like, how, let me put it this way, what does not exist that this might portend like shall exist in 5 years, in 10 years, in 15 years?
Again, apologies if I'm sharing a very global South or Indian centric perspective, but India right now is, like I said, it's going through a very slippery cycle towards authoritarianism. The type of journalism that we often used to admire is pretty much disappearing. I think Khabar Lahariya and there are a number of different other organizations. There's another organization called CGNet Swara, which is a more Bluetooth to source content based journalism network. They're trying to create these more hyper local networks so that a lot of these stories, like during the COVID crisis, like India had, like I am based in Delhi. Delhi was heavily affected. Lack of oxygen everywhere. It was not being documented in the stories. The government would not acknowledge it. To this day, they do not acknowledge it. Khabar Lahariya was at the forefront of kind of showing what was happening on the ground. Like if you think that Delhi, a metropolitan city, which has 200, 300 hospitals, is going through this crisis. What is the state of the rural village, which has one hospital, which has one doctor who's not even present 3 days a week? What were they going through? So these networks were really important in surfacing those ground realities. And I feel like in the coming years, it's only going to become stronger, because you see, as a counterbalance to rise of authoritarianism, you see a lot of, especially female voices and especially Dalit voices coming through about trying to shine a light on what is really happening in the country, what is really going to happen in the country over the next few years.
And does the emergence of Khabar Lahariya surprise you at all? Or is it something you thought, does it feel sort of like, yeah, this is right in this moment, or something that wasn't as expected? It's
surprising because one of my favorite quotes about Indian history is by this Indian historian called Ramchandra Guha. And he says, everything you've heard about India is true, but so is the opposite. So Khabar Lahariya is the most ideal, I feel like is a great example, because being someone who grew up in an Indian society, I'm seeing the type of oppressions that exist in that society. I would never imagine that you have young women, like if you're a 21-year-old woman in rural India, you have no power. You are heavily exposed to violence. There's a higher risk of facing consequences for your action. To see these women coming out on a very digital platform where you're putting your faces out, you're raising your voices, I just never expected would happen. So in a way, it's unexpected, but at the same time, India does have a fairly deep and rich traditions of people coming from different communities and different backgrounds, particularly backgrounds who've been discriminated, and raising their voices. So it's both inspiring, but at the same time, it's unexpected.
Valdez and Erica, any Thoughts or questions?
The timing of it of something like this might be interesting in terms of COVID, but it reminds me a lot of when dispatches like something like bitch.com or bitch media came out, and they were very pointed at almost like the hyper needs of feminism at the time, and being critical of what feminism is and then also what it could be. So when little outlets like that came out, I guess like maybe like mid 2000s, it was really interesting to see what, I guess, how we conceive of like of journalism, but then also the needs of a more hyper local community. So when dispatches like you're mentioning do pop up, I get excited, and then I'm also like, what kind of interventions, I guess, come out of small organizing like that? Is it just reporting on the ground, or are there different types of interventions that end up being accumulated around particularly?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Kapil, I'm curious if there's a way you would contextualize it within other upstarts and innovations within journalism over, say, the last 20 years.
So with Khabar Lahariya, like I said, it's an organization which has been around for 25 years. So it wasn't really a response to COVID, but I think just access to cheaper technology and COVID happening at like those two combinations really propelled them into a bigger spaare. And of course the Oscar documentary, I think, but I shouldn't say that. I think their impact was very visible to people on the ground. It was just people like me who are living in urban centric localities that you're not necessarily aware of them. To kind of talk about what are some of the outcomes or interventions, I think the biggest one, education and caste are intertwined very deeply in India. The aspect of so like the upper caste, like Brahmin caste, for example, the top of the top is generally seen as educators. They kind of protect that space as kind of a sacred space to them. And as a consequence of that has been like preventing different people from different communities, especially tribal and Dalit communities, being able to access these different, access educational resources, because again, education being the foundation for you to create different interventions down the line, whether it's health, future, livelihoods, whatever it may be. I think organizations like Khabar Lahariya, I feel like hyper-localized organizations start that process, like that first step of just breaking the barrier to getting education, and then it's open to your imagination. Like I see so many different interesting organizations that have popped up. Like there is Equity Labs, which is based in North America, is an amazing example. They work towards kind of demonstrating how the caste structure shows itself in North American societies. They help with kind of helping different academics, particularly academics from certain communities, certain backgrounds, achieve different scales that they otherwise would not have been able to. So a lot of these like interventions, I feel like are very open-ended. You see a lot of different types. They turn into businesses. Like even a young woman opening up a business and being able to talk about her business on a Khabar Lahariya like platform is a huge win. It's going to have tremendous impact over the next few generations, because now you have a story in that community of this woman doing something, and those stories really matter. Of course, there'll be a lot of social innovation. There'll be a lot of businesses which are happening and will happen, but I think it's more about the aspect of introducing stories of transformation, introducing stories of change within the fabric of the structure, within the fabric of the societies that I feel like are going to be hugely impactful.
Are there some of those? And sorry, go ahead, Erica.
Oh, I was just going to ask if you felt that the small organizing that was happening in a group like this and in this kind of journalism was playing a bigger role on how the technologies that are being adopted in those communities are being shaped. Like you mentioned, like they have now this like digital platform, and that's quite different than how they were organizing before. And so just also embedding some of their values.
That's a very interesting question. So that's where I think what Commonplace is also trying to do. 70% of India's population lives in rural spaces. But if you look into the market, if you look at what type of products the private sector is coming up with, they're still very urban centric. There is a very strong desire in organizations like Amazon, Facebook. Facebook very infamously tried to democratize internet for rural India, as they very famously tried to do about 5 or 6 years ago, but failed miserably. Different organizations have tried to do that. They have tried to penetrate into rural communities. Unfortunately, it's I would say it's not always has been with a very honest intent. It's still very catered towards a male-centric upper caste audience. So when we talk about audiences of like young women coming from tribal communities, young women coming from Dalit communities, or just young women in rural communities, you do not have a lot of technology spaces or technology organizations who are working with them. There are, of course, really good NGOs that are trying to kind of fill in that gap. There's a few organizations that I can think of the top of my mind who are doing those challenges, who are trying to kind of create better technological solution. But at the end of the day, there is still a lot more to be done. There's a lot more contextualization that needs to be done. So when we often talk about like what is an internet which is designed for rural women, or what is an internet which is designed for women in general, particularly in India, I think those types of discussions still need to go much further. That conversation needs to have much further. And I think organizations like Commonplace and other organizations who are working in this space are just starting in that process. But I think that process will only succeed once there is better policy making, once there's better direction from the government, and there is more honest investment by private sector players.
One thing that struck me in your earlier comment about the education and caste, and the notion of the educator caste, it's such an interesting contrast to a North American context where often the narrative is sort of lamenting that we do not value educators enough, and that the class and profession of educators is sort of not valued. And we often, don't think about that, along with the notion that one thing that actually does is prevent a sort of gatekeeping that can happen when educators are, I'll say, air quote, valued extremely highly in society. So it was interesting just hearing that. It wasn't something that I had thought of in terms of just how access plays out.
I'll share from my perspective, right? I come from a very privileged background. I moved to Canada when I was 16, and it's shameful, but it's the truth. Like, I was not aware of the type of discrimination, caste discrimination, that existed in my schools, in my localities, in my families. And I think the biggest reason for that was education. Like, caste was not something which was ever discussed in our classes. All of my teachers were upper caste teachers, so there was a very clear perspective that they would impart on your students. There are discussions that I have with my friends where it's often a very difficult discussion for them to acknowledge a lot of these realities that exist in our country, even though, like I said, 70% to 80% of India is coming from these discriminated castes, and yet we're unable to kind of surface these challenges, and education has played a massive role in it. Unfortunately, it's something that, like I said, is something we struggle with, I struggle with, people at Commonplace struggle with, that how do you better acknowledge these faults, and how can you enable more people to kind of join on the other side? Like, how can you push more people into aspects of education? So within our programs, like say our digital literacy programs, we don't go in the aspect of Kapil is going to go and teach a class to young girls. Rather, we go with the aspect of, can we find young girls, like girls between 18 and 25, who are coming from the community, who have an interest, who want to, of course, everybody has an interest in education, but who are motivated to kind of become teachers, skilling them, providing them with the resources, and getting them to be the educators of those communities, so that those perspectives that they feel are sacred to their experience are actually represented. Unfortunately, I don't feel like I'm the best person to talk about this barrier, but I can talk about my experiences, that it was never something that was talked about. It was never something that was acknowledged, and the repercussions are just massive.
A question also, circling back to something you mentioned before that I'm interested in, is just how does the caste structure show itself in North America?
So again, I can only talk from what I've read and what I've seen. I think the biggest example is there was a case in North America with in the company Cisco. Cisco had employs a lot of Indians. They have a huge base in India as well. So the issues at Cisco were there were a lot of. So one of the biggest ways that people kind of identify what caste you are is your last name. So people will do everything as possible to kind of figure out what your last name is. And once they know your last name, their behavior towards you changes. Again, this is what I've learned from my friends, what I've read. So a lot of the discrimination that was happening in Cisco, like there were cases where developers who've been working with the company for multiple years were being overshadowed for bringing in newer people. Certain people were being hired because they came from certain universities which have very heavy caste connotations in relationship to upper caste, over other maybe more capable employees which were coming from lower caste, which were coming from Dalit communities, from tribal communities. Just social isolation. There was a ton of social isolation happening in terms of not being involved in, like, when as an immigrant coming to Canada, right, there was a lot of support that you try to rely upon your family and your community. But a majority of, I would say, the Indian immigrant population is upper caste. So if you're coming in from a Dalit population or from a Dalit background or from a tribal background, I presume you do not have access to the same type of resources. In fact, you're often ostracized and you're often kind of provided with more challenges in front of you. But yeah, I think I would encourage people to look into the Cisco case. I think that's a really good example of how caste is showing itself in San Francisco, which is often seen as like a very liberal society.
Right. Okay. Signal and noise, Erica. Khabar Lahariya. Did I say it right?
Khabar Lahariya.
Khabar Lahariya. Not even close.
It's a tough one.
You have to roll your R's, Rob, I think.
Don't know if that'll allow. Yeah, I think it is a noisy signal. I'm super curious to know what patterns of or techniques or strategies are used on the ground that are like very special to this kind of community organizing, and the strategies that are being used in those cases, and if they're subverting like the website that they currently have, or yeah, just like what their little strategies, maybe some of the like finer tuned details of how their everyday organizing transpires. But I do think it's very interesting when small networks of like community journalism come together out of like what seems like absolutely like the fringe of what's necessary and almost out of a survival. So
like I'll share a short anecdote. So like on one of my trips of like doing field research, I had this very interesting experience where I had this local leader coming from a discriminated community. So often these are the leaders who are most motivated to kind of bring in researchers, bring in attention, to kind of bring in more resources into the community so that there's a increased focus on what's happening in the community. So this local leader was very adamant about, please come to my space, please come to my community, talk to my community. I'll explain to them why you're there. I'll try to convince them, but I think it's really important that you talk to them. And at the time, this research project was focused around trying to uncover what are new aspirational patterns which are emerging in young couples, particularly in rural spaces, and how it was affecting couple dynamics, agencies of women, and as well as like opportunities that men and women in general had in rural spaces. What we kind of saw was there, as soon as I got into the space, I explained what the research project was once. I explained it twice. By the third time, there was still a lot of pushback coming from the communities, and the local leader kind of pulled me on the side, and he's like, see, you need to understand, you have to explain it once, twice, 3, 4, 5 times. And even in the 6th time, they won't understand you because, but you still have to try. And that lesson was really important because I think that's exactly what Khabar Lahariya or organizations like Khabar Lahariya do. They try to fill in that gap of technical skills that exist in these communities, but at the same time, they try to overcome the barriers of skepticism that these communities have, that are people who are coming into these spaces really trying to help me. So for example, if I enter into any rural village in India with a smartphone, everybody's on high alert because you're a new person in that space, their behaviors change, their actions change. But if somebody like a female from that community is going around in that neighborhood, it's going to remain the same. She will see and document what the true realities are. So I think what they have been really successful at is kind of bridging that gap between getting women to adopt digital technologies and becoming more ambitious and more, I would say, even upfront about how they kind of stamp their authority in their spaces. In terms of like what are some specific techniques, I know they do a lot of workshops. I know they do a lot of training sessions with local NGOs. I don't think it's a huge secret in terms of process. I think it's just good old dedication, good old passion about just trying to keep talking. Similar to that, what a local leader was saying, you should not give up. Like this is what happens. This is very honestly, this is what happens after 5th or 6th times, people will give up, but people from those communities, they know the significance and they'll keep going. And that's the credit to organizations like Khabar Lahariya.
Well, this signaling noise.
There's something about social movements being framed as weak signals that irritates me. Not that what you said. So this is just like the way that we frame what a weak signal is, because it's like something that builds up momentum. It's the density of links that are made between people. It's the claims for dignity and a capacity to make decisions together, like none of which I would want to call a weak signal in the sense of being like something unexpected. So in that sense, I'll say no. And I don't think we should think of social movements as weak signals in that sense. I'll say like one thing I thought was really cool is the fact that it's like paper, and like the affordances of like paper in particular, I think are probably quite underrated at the moment and like very interesting. And there's like very particular ways that I'm sure like as a designer, sorry, I'm speaking to you, Kapil, I guess, but like as a designer, or maybe everybody on here actually, like there's particular ways that meaning and information changes when it's like held in your hand, right? Like you can literally grasp ideas, you can pass them to other people, you can put them physically in a space and see them all together as a group. Like there's so many different things you can do that you can't really do with digital. And so that kind of made me interested. So, you know, if I were to angle it towards a signal, for me, that part is pretty cool. But like you had said, like there's a lot of newspapers still in India compared to other parts of the world. So maybe it's not unexpected, but relative to other parts of the world.
I think that aspect of a paper being written by a journalist or a paper being written by a woman coming from that community, I think adds another lens of importance. Like newspapers in general do have a lot of significance, but because there is a massive gap, like in books, publications, academics, journalism, news media, there's a massive gap of voices representing 70% of the nation. So I think paper is a very strong factor. It's the cost of entering into that space is far smaller than I think any other medium of public discourse.
Yeah, that's a cool signal within the greater signal here. All this, and also agree with your point about weak signals. Like, I mean, certainly there is something signaled by a movement like this one, but yeah, we might not want to refer to it as a weak signal. And on the affordances of paper, I'm certainly writing on a yellow legal pad here right now. So I agree with that. And I can't show it to you, but you can hear it in the background there. I can't show it to you because it literally won't show up. What's up, Erica?
I was just going to say, I would just disagree with the statement that social movements and movements shouldn't be considered fringe or a weak signal. I think there's a lot that goes on in social movements that can be seen as something that is perhaps on the edges of what we know or what have you. And yeah, when you find those like smaller moments within the like larger instance of people coming together, I think that's what makes a signal really curious and exciting. But it's hard to remove like a technique again from the group that's using it.
Mm-hmm. I think that's fair. Bob, did you care to respond to that at all?
No, yeah, that's fine. I don't have like a strong. Yeah. I personally think it's just like I just think it's off to think about. I think social movements are more important. Maybe that's what I would get at. So,
yeah, by that, Erica, signal or noise? I mean, sorry, signal. Erica, what's your weakest signal? I have 2 lines, and what's your weakest signal?
You got to write them down.
I know. I have the paper.
Yeah, so my signal is about baby X. And I've just noticed a few articles floating around about the idea of a virtual baby or this desire or need to take care of virtual children. So this was also described as like perhaps being the Tamagotchi generation. And this has come up a little bit where there's like virtual partners or you're taking care of a virtual entity of some sort. But this one struck me as different just because I guess there's this assumption that people are looking for like a novel type of parenthood experience. Yeah, so basically the signal is about people who are seeking out virtual babies to take care of rather than real babies.
What's baby X?
Baby X is basically just a simulated baby, and it's primarily used for, I guess, training different neural models. I don't know, computer vision. It's under like this, like it's this mix of just AI and a baby. It's by Soul Machine, and it basically used for, or has been said to be used for, parents who are enduring or going through some sort of grief process of perhaps losing a child or not being able to have children. And so Baby X is kind of this weird solution in between of having something online, and that there's like this need or desire for that.
So how does one experience it? It's an app?
It's an avatar. So
it's an avatar. Okay.
Yeah. So Soul Machine, basically, they are this organization that creates avatars for like any kind of social, so they say social need.
They call this a social need. Okay.
That's kind of what they've mentioned the organization does. They have like avatars that can be used for any kind of like everyday need, whether it's like a companion or like something that's more like service oriented. And Baby X is just like the youngest version of these avatars, and it's to fulfill the need of if you want to have a virtual baby, or if you want to experience a different kind of parenting, this is what you would go to Baby
And
X.
it's similar to like a Tamagotchi where you have to do certain tasks. Like, is it a game essentially? Is it sort of like parenting Farmville or something like that? Or like, wait, how does this work?
Because it's been compared to Tamagotchis, from what I'm gathering is that it's learning based off of the ways you exchange with it. There's some sort of like simulated care going on, but I'm not
like
exactly sure.
Experiment in AI or something too, in some way.
Yeah. So the signal is kind of like about these now virtual babies kind of popping up and what they mean. And I personally find it odd find what's interesting is like the transition from when tech basically goes from being geared towards children or like something that's exploring like what children are, to all of a sudden, basically when a toy goes from being a toy to tech, is what I'm saying with just the idea of like an AI baby or something.
Yeah, this one is not. Do you know who the users, the parents are generally who are engaging with Baby X?
I know I didn't really get into like who is the target. I just assume it's anyone really who's looking for like the social and emotional companionship of like a baby.
Whoever wants to LARP as a parent in some way. Also the possibility, you had mentioned something along the lines that it's something you might use if you're grieving an unborn or not a baby that's not made it.
I read from one article that it's supposed to help parents grieve if they've had like a loss or a death, an infant death or something.
Wow.
Yeah. So there's, I think, a couple uses that is currently or ways that it's being thought of being used. And a part of me feels like a lot of it is justifying training certain AI models, which it is a game. Like it says that like the baby learns based off of like how much you engage with it and how you engage with it. So I'm like cautious of that tale, but then also really interested in who's using it and for what reasons.
I just looked it up. This is a fairly old experiment too. Is that right?
Yeah, I guess it's been in the works for a little while, but it's recently been popping up in like a few articles. Yeah, who is using a virtual baby? What's this like intersection of babies and AI? And it seems to be coming from like somewhat the futurist community who is kind of speculating on what like these like virtual avatars and mean to people. But I thought having a novel parenting experience is just a bit strange to think about.
That's the promise, that like you have a novel parenting experience. I can't imagine a parenting experience even ever not being novel for anyone, even after having had multiple kids potentially, but who knows? I've never had one.
I guess it's just like it can't be compared to having a real kid.
Perhaps not. I don't know. It's funny. I just recently learned that there's a Tamagotchi graveyard. I want to say in Virginia.
Can you resurrect them?
Yeah.
Can we do it?
Right to resurrect. Yeah.
Right to resurrect. Yeah, I guess another question is like, what would the lives of a digital offspring look like? Like, how far would you carry that virtual like baby with you? Is it different than regular parenting and like parenthood? I don't know.
Yeah, so it's all fun and games until digital babies become digital teenagers.
Exactly. And another thing that I was reading was that there's actually a decline of children in like major cities in the US.
Mhm.
So that somehow was also like an opening to why people would be interested in these digital babies or like something like Baby X. I think I was just, yeah.
I mean, fertility, certainly there's a narrative that fertility has been declining.
I mean, Erica, honestly, like looking at the website, my impression, and maybe it's different in the articles, but I'm like, it's just a commercial vaporware project or something. That's how I see it. I mean, feel free to push back, but I kind of see it as like, oh, they're just trying to they it's like, what was that robot Sophie or something that like Saudi Arabia gave like citizenship as like a stunt a few years ago, you know? This like kind of futurist stunt to just confuse people around what like uh is alive and not alive. You'll have to correct me because maybe in the article something else is going on, like maybe something changed, but the Soul Machine website, I'm kind of like, oh, it's just like it's a commercial product. It's being sold to like imagined customers who don't exist yet, but if somebody wants for whatever reason inside of their commercial services to have like a kind of baby avatar, you know, like whether that's in some future metaverse world or as like a clippy, you know, word like clippy add-on to the program or whatever, or like in whatever app you're making, et cetera, you could kind of deploy this thing. But yeah, I don't like, are people actually individually taking care of these things and treating them as Tamagotchis or something like that? Like from the Soul Machine site, I don't get that sense, but there might be something else going on that I'm missing.
Yeah, just a quick glance at the Soul Machine site. Looks like they sort of design and develop like like avatars that can perhaps provide services in a digital world for anyone. I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah, like digital concierges, but it's kind of funny that they have a baby.
Yeah.
You know, it's like,
yeah, it's an interesting like marketing tool apparently, but also that this name Baby X, because when I said it's been around for a long time or whatever, I mean, there's a bunch of things kind of popped up. There's like apparently a musical artist called Baby X. There's a couple films.
there's a lot of Baby X going on.
Yeah, and there was something else that popped into my head, which was that I believe its origins were on Ally McBeal with the dancing baby like avatar, which at the time was very novel for its sort of just being this like 3D graphic of a dancing baby.
The cha-cha baby.
Yeah, which it doesn't look exactly like this, but as soon as I saw the pictures of this, I was like, oh, reminds me of weird thing from the 90s or whenever that was.
I want to pull on the thread of like the aspect of people who've lost a child, like potential use cases there, because like I've noticed this in some of my networks where people have, especially during COVID, where people have lost loved ones, their Facebook profiles. And I know there have been some companies in the past who've kind of gone into this avenue of managing somebody's Facebook or their online social media presence after somebody has passed away. But especially during COVID, I saw a lot of people, especially parents who lost their sons and daughters, kind of almost like these digital shrines and trying to maintain the Facebook. So I'll take a very specific example. Somebody I went to school with, he unfortunately passed away, and his dad still manages his Facebook profile to this day. And I think it's his way of kind of engaging with both his son, because like all the pages his son's liked, all the videos his son was watching, all the people his son was talking to, he still gets that connection. And it also becomes on the other side a way for people who knew his son to still be in touch with him, to still have that connection, to kind of connect with that parent. Because once you kind of lose, like the son being the intermediary, once that disappears, doesn't mean you didn't have a connection or a bond with your parent as well. So I kind of do see some merit in this idea of something like Baby X being maybe applied for people who've lost a loved one, whether it's a son, whether it's a mother, whether it's a father. I do see the parallels to some of those Black Mirror episodes, but I do genuinely feel there is some application, and I can see people applying it in a way of healing. Like sometimes I deal with the idea of once I disappear, what happens to my online profile? Like I'm very suspicious about like what's going to happen with all the preferences that I have. Is Google going to launch a Kapil AI robot sometime in the future trying to sell products to my offsprings or to my family members? I can see a future where that happens. So it's an interesting line of thought.
That's funny, right? Be careful what you click, though. It's like, it'd be funny, the idea that like, what gets passed on to your family is just like the darkest side of yourself that only your browser has ever seen before or whatever.
Yeah, this would be the worst way for your parents to find out what your browsing history is.
Yeah. You start talking, you just see an avatar of you, you just start talking about all your, browsing history. There's something interesting to me about, the whole history of these sort of games that are like a type of labor, but also do tie to a human need. In this case, like there's, I think, something intrinsic within us to want to provide, care for, whatever it might be, a Tamagotchi, a child, a pet, a plant, and people derive meaning and responsibility, and the meaning that comes with responsibility from that. And so there's been different forms of simulations of those for a long time. And then they also can function as as training wheels or whatever, and a sort of a way of training oneself or finding out if you're ready or if you want something. And is kind of interesting. I remember seeing like television shows as a kid about home ec classes where they had to like care for an egg or something like that, and pretend to nurture this egg and not break it as though it's a baby or a child. And I guess anyone who plays video games, I don't play a lot, would experience this. But let's say if you play a lot of NBA or Madden or something like that, and you really are engaged, you're trading players, you're doing all those things, you certainly aren't ready to manage an NFL football team, but you will have a lot of knowledge, more than the average person would by doing something like that. And I've heard that people playing, is it Farmville, the big farming game where you're like, you have to do these different farming tasks? People, I don't know anything about these games, but people, live with actually knowledge of like fertilizer and different, like some things that are actually somewhat practical. And if they ever, were in a state of like need, would actually know more than the next person who never played the game or whatever. So I don't know, there's something interesting in just like these video game realms as training grounds for different things that will or could come up, or ways to try on different lifestyles that one might consider.
This aspect of kind of digital training, we're kind of seeing a lot of that coming into the social impact space, where like just going back to like adolescent girls, there's a game that recently launched in India called Go Nisha Go. It's essentially a platform for young girls to kind of reimagine what they want their life trajectory to be. So the entire game is essentially putting that girl in different situations on what if your parents found out watching you watching porn? How do you handle that conversation? What if you want to go for higher education and your dad is not paying for it? How do you handle that situation? So they kind of structure these very specific scenarios, and the game mechanism kind of becomes a way for you to kind of practice those conversations. And some similar programming has also been done with kind of exactly to that point of you were saying about if I manage a team on Madden, I'm not necessarily ready for managing a truly NFL team. But this aspect of if you're managing a child digitally, there might be things that you find out about yourself and the conversations and communications you have with your partners that might apply with once you actually have a child. So we've seen a couple of programs that are trying to enter in this space of kind of having digital, not necessarily digital babies, but it's more like scenario-based modeling through digital interventions of, what if you have a child and you need to find enough money for that child to go to school? Who's going to make those affordances? Will the husband support the child at home? Will the wife quit her job? Like these very common situations that you don't necessarily face until they're like presented in front of you.
Yeah, it's a form of scenario planning. Some of those examples strike me as like comedic almost, but maybe it would be useful. Like just the idea of running a scenario of like a humiliating like high school situation or something like that as in advance of going to high school, so you know what to do when inevitably something humiliating happens to you in junior high or whatever. Yeah, it's interesting. And to what extent those things would truly prepare you.
Yeah.
And to some extent, having some knowledge of what to do if, something happens is super important for kids, and telling them is one thing and having them kind of simulate it is another.
Rob, your example of like a farming game, I would disagree that you learn anything about farming. What you learn is like how to go about deconstructing the rules that game has set up, and what it understands about farming, right? And so you're learning at this remove where like indirectly it's true, whatever the game developers know about farming or think they know about it, you're also kind of learning. And that might be like generally true, and that's fine, but like it's definitely not the kind of hands-on memory learning or bodily learning that actual farming is, where you have to make judgments based on like the complexity of real world situations. So it's like very different because and I think that stretches to the things Kapil brought up and your skepticism, Rob, about it, because I kind of feel skeptical about all of those examples as well, where I think the stuff you learn in games, it doesn't transfer like across domains. It's like indirect. And what you learn is more like a cleverness with like deconstructing algorithms that are given to you or something, like that's really what you're learning.
I think you're right. And I think though, in some cases, people might learn not much more than they would learn from a book, say. Maybe something slightly more based on sort of temporal patterns that occur the way that the way you play it out in a game. But I think what I've heard anyways, is that they're learning a vocabulary. They're learning something that actually does serve as a starting point, and completely agree with you that they're not, it's not the same at all. It's not, you're not learning this sort of the bodily experience and movement and ability to read things just as they are in real life, but you're learning something, and maybe it is more akin to what you would learn if you had just read a lot and never been to a farm in your life. But maybe people aren't going to do that or retain it the same way without it being gamified.
Yeah, I think the parallel to the book is good. And I agree that there's maybe something in like this like scenario modeling around like your own emotional life. It can be a little hackneyed or something, maybe. Like when I think of something like that, I just think of like, oh, those like terrible school exercises where they asked me to like write in a notebook my plans for 10 years from now, and I was just like, this stuff it really never helped me. Like I just didn't.
Yeah. Well, how about this? Do fire drills help you? I don't know.
Yeah, but that's bodily memory. That's like you're trying to ingrain a pure reaction in your body running through a particular building.
Right.
Yes, I would say that's beautiful. Useful.
But a game might get you closer than just like talking through it. So.
I think for bodily stuff, it works. I think it works for the military. That's why they use it. Because like, it is just like, how do you provide cover? How do you run between places? It's very bodily. And so by doing that virtually, you do build that into the muscle memory of your body. Like it does literally trigger the muscles, even if you're not moving.
Right.
Oh, I would like if it was like, it had nothing to do with like a baby, and it was just about like the next generation of training yourself for the next generation of kids. And it was just throwing images at you of like what's to come for the next 50 years in hopes that you'll understand how to be a good parent.
Okay, so let's also
the real parental training.
There's this other side of like, what are they really doing with this? So by having people parent the AI baby, is the experiment really about trying to understand so that they could simulate parenting and collect that information about how people would do it and what's happening there? Another alternative here is that this is like a very Shane Saunderson kind of like project in studying how people interact with a AI baby. You know what I mean? Like just that, like not pretending that it's anything other than it's just like, are people going to actually be kind to an AI baby? Are they going to, do they treat it very differently than a real baby? Do they, these kinds of, do they actually care the way they would for a human? What makes it different? How do people interact differently knowing something that is a robot?
Very well be the things that it's training. And this is it was an experimental project, so I can imagine those are some of the like takeaways from like engaging with an AI baby. But yeah, there's always a trade-off, I guess, in terms of what that relationship of like training it and what you're training it on and what you're giving up in those instances. I do find that if tech is somehow being tested with like a baby figure, or like it's being trained because you're training a baby, like that almost makes it seem less intimidating as a thing, and that has to meet some like parental code of safety. So maybe it's just like a habit of tech trying to like make tech seem less scary in some cases.
Don't let this AI fool you that it's cute. Don't let the super intelligence fool you with its cute baby avatar. Yeah, interesting.
Have you seen the film Paprika? The anime film Paprika? There's just like there's one of the scenes, and I think it's like a common image in anime for whatever reason, but is of like a giant baby just like walking through the city streets, like 3 times the size of a normal human, so not like too big or whatever. But I like this idea of like there's no reason a baby, like an AI baby, quote unquote, has to act like a human baby. And so that gap and juxtaposition of like what kinds of physical and emotional cues of visualization of a human gives off versus the kind of cognitive interactions that you have with it, like opens up a whole design space of just bizarro interactions where you could have like a like grandfather personality inside of like a baby visualization or whatever. And like I don't know what that means. I mean, maybe it's very not that interesting, but
maybe the grandfather is inside.
Just to kind of latch on Valdez, your idea, because I and similar to what like Erica was also talking about, I think these tools, I completely agree. I don't think they're training tools. I think training should never be the focus. It's always that common conversation, right? Digital education versus face-to-face education. What is a reasonable expectation from digital education? And when I hear of tools like these, to me, they're very similarly like in that digital education bracket. Like there's only so much they can achieve. I think the training aspect, definitely not. But I think kind of what the kind of the scenario that you're talking about there, Val, this aspect of imagination. Like when I think about, say, like some of these tools, when you apply to like different communities, like if I take a community which doesn't necessarily have like some of the knowledge gap communities that I'm talking about, there's a very clear dearth of like technical resources or technical skills that exist in those communities. How would they act to climate change? Like can tools like these help them kind of identify or at least be prepared or at least even imagine like what is climate change going to be for me as a person who's coming from a very vulnerable situations, or even not, even in like a typical urban situation, like what could that reality be? I feel like these tools could be much more effective in at least pushing people towards like thinking about these certain scenarios or these certain futures. Again, I don't think the aspect is training, but that aspect of sparking imagination or kind of lighting that fire, I feel like could be effective if done in the right way. Like I do believe there is some interest there.
That for me, it's always that comes down to the execution, that there's no real reason why an AI avatar or a virtual reality experience should be any better than a telenovela or a graphic novel or comic book at sort of bringing you into a certain world or certain experience, preparing you for certain questions or asking certain questions or enabling empathy. All of them really depends on the quality of the art and somebody's kind of own immersion in it.
But I do feel these tools offer better accessibility. Like again, the aspect of, if I look at, like I'm a huge graphic novel fan, they're crazy expensive. Even video games as a concept, like you go try to buy a Switch game these days, $80 it starts for. It's not necessarily accessible. I think mobile gaming started that pathway, and I would like to see more people explore these tools on more cheaper platforms, because it's a much easier entry point, right? It's the same thing as like watching a YouTube video. It's very low cost of entry. I might be intrigued, it might not work, and I agree. It comes down to like how do you execute it.
But to the earlier point about paper, that could be more accessible one. But I take your point. For the average kid, let's say a mobile game might be more, at least, culturally accessible or desirable than a printed story or something like that, short story. Signal and noise for you, Kapil.
See, it's very hard to judge these things because I think there needs to be one more factor for something like this to really become into existence. For now, I would say noise, just because I think a lot of these trends come and go. Tamagotchi was a really big thing in the 90s. It's seeing some resurgence now. I would like to believe there's applications for these things, and I do believe there are some genuine applications, but is it ever going to reach mainstream? Is there going to be heavy enough investment? Probably not, unless Amazon decides to create AI babies. And Rob, you're just talking to your future self while you're buying something next time on Amazon. Maybe
Right.
That's the only case I can think for it. So noise for now.
Lawless?
Oh, you all know what's coming.
What's coming?
Okay, well, so barring the examples that I don't know if they exist or not, but around like people actually interacting with this model or this avatar visualization, I think it's an example to me of like very much like keynote futurists kind of wishy-washy thinking in terms of like not being very conceptually clear and importing categories that don't apply like improperly to make people think that there's something going on, some kind of insight, when there isn't. Like it's not a baby, like it's there, and I'm sure like if we dig into it, there probably was like interesting technical stuff like in the back, when the project started. But from the examples I see of like the actual digital avatar baby thing, I'm just like, oh, this is like exactly the stuff that I really dislike in like kind of big futures thinking, which is kind of just like saying that there's going to be all these like avatars and metaverses and everything's going to be different and yet exactly the same. Like, like what interests me, and we didn't really talk about it and we don't have time to talk about it, but is that like baby consciousness is like very weird. Human baby consciousness is very strange. And because it's trying to learn a massive amount and it's in this state of like unbelievable plasticity that as adults we just like do not have access to. If you interact with the baby, it's like it's an alien. Like what's going on in its head? Like it doesn't even have a sense of self. Like it doesn't even have a sense of its own body. Like its body extends into the environment. Like there's so many weird things that happen with babies, and like that parallel had like this AI baby discussion gone into those questions, I would be like, yeah, there's definitely signally type stuff to think about how we, what the impact of like understanding baby consciousness is going to be on like AI research going into the future. But the idea of like a avatar baby, I'm just like, yeah, I think it's like keynote futures vaporware stuff.
After hearing what you said, I'd almost be more interested to know what like the baby intelligence like in the womb before birth would be, or like that experiment. But yeah, your point is it opens a lot of interesting doors with machine sensing and consciousness before the mirror stage type of questions. Very curious.
When I mentioned that tech will often use children or kids as a metaphor for like they created this software and it's come from their rib, or they like it's their spawn or their like offspring, like that metaphor is often used already in tech.
This project's my baby type of talk, right? Like people say this stuff all the time, like, oh no, like when someone's super attached to the software they developed or whatever, they'll refer to it as literally their baby, or their baby. Or they'll refer to themselves as gods in other cases.
And I just wonder how much that extends into the kind of research or justifying certain research in training like consciousness, in training like an AI consciousness. I think that's often the justification there, is that it's like it's malleable and it's like something that needs to be treated as if it's a baby. I guess I'm really curious to know, like, is there a need and desire from like the average person to want to like follow a digital entity or like a something virtual and care for it long term, or if there's an expiry. There's projects on that, but just the desire to actually care for something that's a digital thing.
Yeah, there's something. What's the AI you can train in this sort of like very like natural interface is an interesting question that I guess is what it's trying to get at, and may still be, confusing some concepts, as Valdez was saying. For me, this become totally a signal, just especially where the conversation led us. So it led to some other very interesting questions, and I don't know if I want to make the like critical futurist assumption that like, some of these things won't happen. Like maybe I go that route too often. So I'm going to be open to this and go with signal. Valdez, what's your weakest signal?
So I brought something that for once I was like excited about and interested in, and don't just think is puzzling. Or at least I am now. We'll see what it's like in 10 minutes. But Switzerland had some proposal out in 2016 to develop an autonomous underground transport system just for cargo. In the last year, it had been at the time in 2016 just been kind of this like pipe dream thing, kind of this like, oh, whatever, it's just some like futurists like mumbo jumbo. But now they're like starting to do something with it. It's not very big. I forget what the exact detail is, but like they got funding, I think like some $1 billion, some company to kind of the way Musk is doing it, like to do a kind of pilot project, like across 30 kilometers somewhere in Switzerland. And Switzerland's kind of interesting for a number of reasons, but one of them being that it has this really like intense survivalist mindset. And so like there's just so much infrastructure buried in the mountains that they have like essentially an entire second civilization underground. And now they're adding this kind of moving cargo. And when I heard about it, I was like, that makes so much more sense than the Musk thing of like moving people in cars underground. It's just like, why would you do that? Like, but moving like Amazon style packages, just like boxes, because you can build the tunnels way smaller, you don't have to light them. You don't have to take care of like the terror that people feel inside of like, which was an issue on subways. The original subways didn't have windows because the engineers were like, why would you have windows? You're underground. But people were just terrified of being in a windowless subway. So they had to add windows, even though there was nothing to see. Like none of that is like in consideration in moving cargo. It made me think, I was like, there's something poetic. It's kind of like the way a root system of a tree distributes, nutrients under the soil. It's now the social layer of that, or a version of that for like cities or something like that. The roots of a city, just like packages going all over the place. I just love the idea. So that's kind of what I got at.
Yeah.
And it would free up a ton of space above ground, and it just made so much sense.
Yeah, I think you're onto something with that. It is amazing, like going through the tunnels in that part of the world in a vehicle already. These long tunnels that go through mountains and driving. But yeah, it makes a lot more sense to be able to do that with something smaller. It's like a better Internet of Things in a way.
Yeah.
Where the things actually move through the internet.
And better like autonomous, like the problem with like autonomous vehicles is you could say in one way is like humans, because like we're unpredictable, and when you have mixed environments where they're interacting, you're going to get accidents, like that chess machine that broke that kid's finger this week, like in Moscow. I don't know if anyone saw that.
I brought that in as a signal. Yeah. Why I just read that this morning and I was like, why does this read so hilarious? Poor kid, but it was so funny as a story.
The response too of the officials was funny, which was that the kid had moved his pawn at the wrong time, and so he was at fault, which I thought was great.
Yeah,
very like Russian thing to do. But yeah, so that's like the problem is that the mixing of the two things. Whereas if you can separate them, if you can exclude humans from a zone, there's no problem with running autonomous machinery. Like it suddenly becomes so much more useful and like kind of less high tech. Like all the stuff that Musk is trying to build to anticipate humans, it's like you don't need to if there are no humans around, like it'd be a lot simpler.
I'd agree with that statement generally. I am curious to know like how the logistics of this underground system, I guess cargo system, is different from like a regular train system outside of it not being on top, it's just under. So it just opens up, because I feel like a lot of cargo is actually done through shipping unless unless you're like aren't heavily shipping, or you don't have like ports and you don't have the infrastructure to actually carry things through shipping or have them transported, but most things are. So I just be curious to know what like an underground cargo system, the challenges of building something like that, maintaining it, and then
How big is it? Is it like parcels, like, you know what I mean? Like parcel sized, or is it like much, are we talking like shipping cart size? Are we talking like, what's the dimensions of these pipes?
I think they're kind of like subway size pipes, but they have 3 tracks in them. Well, okay, when I say subway size, that I guess that varies a lot, so it's hard to say. But like for like one subway train, like if a tunnel was just for one subway train, I think it's supposed to be about that big. And I'm guessing that's just because the machinery to make all of that exists already or something like that. So it's
Right,
not, you don't
right,
need
right.
to.
It doesn't need 3-4 lanes or something. You might just, yeah.
Yeah.
Like
Well, and then they are smaller than
like a small,
because they don't need to carry
smaller train.
people, and
Interesting.
they're supposed to be more like individual, so it's not like you have like a caboose or whatever. It's like they're meant to be. It reminds me a lot of like Amazon factories. Like if you've ever seen or been in them, they have those little things that move around. They're kind of, they're not that big.
yeah, I guess it would take trucks off the road, or like it could have the potential of removing a lot of that need for trucks to transport certain things. But I guess I don't fully know the like context between the demand of why that's something. Is it Iceland, you said?
Switzerland.
Like what's the draw to invest in what's the draw to invest in it? I guess, yeah, I would be curious to know what their current public systems are like transportation systems are like, and what the history there is with.
Did you know more details about like what it's replacing, why it feels warranted for them, or is it just a futuristic experiment?
Like I've been brought up the survivalist thing, so there's kind of like, and everything they do, you always wonder like, oh, is that because you're kind of building a society for some apocalypse that can survive anything, like so that's one side. The other side is just that, like I was saying, like to me at least, it just makes sense. It's like it is a way to, if you can reduce the intersection and interaction of heavy machinery and humans, you like save a lot of lives and injuries basically. And it's, to me, it's nuts that we have 3-ton 400 horsepower vehicles plowing through cities at 50 kilometers an hour. Like there's no need for something like that for the most part.
This will be what kind of energy, or how, but and I know trains
electric,
already,
but it's definitely not combustion,
right?
Underground.
Interesting. I'd never thought of this, but I was like, would you ever pump water to move packages in waterproof containers?
That is
like an
straight
underground
out of
Venice?
Futurama. Just shooting people around in tubes full of water.
Well, not people, just cargo. I mean,
yeah.
I'm just, I don't know. Maybe it would get clogged too much by the packages. We ship water around that way, and it works very well and very efficiently. So
I think this system is interesting to me for the aspect of like democratization of transport. Because if I think about like scalability, like issues for scalability, I think the biggest factor often becomes is like, how do you reach certain spaces? Because the investment to send 2 trucks, 3 trucks is just too high. So I'm kind of curious to find out, are these systems, are these state owned? Are they public-private partnerships? Are they like, what type of applications are they looking at? Because if a system like this was to exist, say in my location, and it's something that anybody could do, which is very common in like the train systems in UK and even in India, like you can just, there's a common bogie that anybody can put stuff in, and it's a very effective resource. if you have this very autonomous system that's available to everyone, what does that mean for small businesses? What does that mean for people who otherwise would be very limited from scale, relying on such future technology?
Yeah, I really like the question, and I hadn't thought of that. I don't know exactly the details. It's probably some public-private type partnership. I don't really know, but I do think eventually, like the post office, like train systems, like they had to be centralized and made into public entities, at least at some point in their history, because they were just more efficient to run that way, because it was just chaos. You couldn't have a private rail line that would allow, like, a common carrier that would allow like 7 different rails to run on it, because it was just too chaotic and it was not efficient. So you had to have like one entity control it all, in a good way. I think, like, I like the idea of like some kind of, this is like a post office but for like goods, that exists that anybody can kind of access. Which, I don't know the details of like how they're doing it in Switzerland.
Yeah, I feel like systems like these are they're kind of warning signs for, if I'm an Amazon, do I really want to have public spaces like these, public tools like these? Because I think it hits towards what makes your value offering unique. So would be curious to see like what would be the take of some of these more large scale online retail businesses where biggest IP is just, we have a really good transportation system.
I'm wondering if they had like a prior package delivery problem, or like there was some sort of chokehold on like how things were currently being delivered, or if it was just something that came out of that survivalist mentality where it's like, how do we improve the infrastructure? Okay, we'll start with how do we get our goods?
Yeah. The only thing I can think of is that there's very treacherous, like twisty, windy mountain driving for truckers who would be moving things around, like say from Italy to Switzerland or whatever. And I don't think there's any real way around that right now.
Even aspect of like climate proofing, like I can, like, even to going back to Valdez, your point about what Musk wants to do with people, and maybe that's the case where I can make an argument for it. Like if you're going towards the spaces where you don't know what the weather is going to look like, it's going to get more and more treacherous. Transportation, like just to give a perspective, Delhi this year had 50-degree temperature. We've never hit. Every year, our temperatures are rising significantly. So there's eventually going to be a point where transportation above ground is just no longer sustainable, or maybe it's just not even safe. So is it just simply future planning from that perspective of, at some point we need to go below the ground and find a much better way and economical way of transporting our resources, whether it's people or whether it's produce.
We've got to go underground.
Like vacuum systems throughout your whole house, except on a larger scale.
Yeah, that's cool. Imagine that getting so complex that the package just pops up through a hole in the ground. I mean, again, we do it with water and electricity. I always think back when we started talking about things like autonomous highways, self-driving cars and all of that. There was this period of time growing up in Vancouver where there was a transit strike and there were no buses to be taken, but the SkyTrain in Vancouver was able to run just by basically being switched on. And so there was nobody policing whether you were taking your ticket, and there was no, there was no security, there was no driver or captain per se, but they were able to just run the SkyTrain, and you could just take the SkyTrain for free from downtown Vancouver to Westminster, Burnaby, or wherever. It's interesting to see that that's possible to run with so few people involved. You can move a lot of people and cargo. Signal or noise, Kapil?
I think signal. I think the politics of such technologies, I feel like, whether it's employed or whether it's not employed, I think will have significant impact. Like I said, I would love to see what an Amazon thinks about technologies like these, or what a Walmart thinks about technologies like these, because I think there's both aspects for empowering communities that otherwise would be inhibited from achieving scale, and at the same time could have, I think, even medical applications or even just like climate proofing applications that I feel like would be interesting. So yeah, I would say it's a strong signal for sure.
I like that. Erica?
I like that framing, Kapil, that you just mentioned, just the difficulty and what it takes to actually get projects like that are like very strongly infrastructure started going, and like planning for that seems very difficult. And then just on the side of it perhaps impacting the flow of like traffic or changing the current system of accessing goods like that, or cargo or shipping packages and what have you. So I think that would be an interesting change and experiment to get into.
Yeah, Signal, boring an internet of cargo tunnels as public utility is a pipe dream everybody can dig. Broadcast from later.